Joining us. Here's a look at some of the top stories we're watching right now.
That President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. But President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone.
Testimony from the House Select Committee investigating the Capitol insurrection drew attention to the increasingly fractured relationship between former President Trump and his vice president, plus the surprising number of people in Trump's inner circle who were texting with a Supreme Court justice's wife. With historically high gas prices and rising inflation, President Biden admits in a new interview that the American people are really down, but says a recession is not inevitable. How the White House is trying to frame the Federal Reserve's recent moves and missteps. And some bumps in the road after some initial optimism over possible federal gun reform. We'll talk to a congresswoman from Nevada about where she thinks the House and Senate could come to an agreement. And later this hour, the Senate passes a historic bill to help millions of veterans exposed to toxic burn pits during military service. It now heads to the House for a final vote, where Speaker Pelosi has pledged to move it quickly and send it to the president's desk. Plus, after calling the Saudi crown prince a pariah, President Biden is heading to Saudi Arabia to meet with him. More on America's historically complicated relationship with the Saudi kingdom ahead. But we begin with day 3 of the January 6th committee hearings. Today, a panel focused on then-President Trump's pressure campaign against former Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the 2020 presidential election. We heard testimony from those close to Mr. Pence about former President Trump's efforts to reject electoral votes in an unprecedented manner. The committee heard from the Vice President's counsel, Greg Jacobs, and retired federal judge Michael Loudermilk, who advised the VP in the aftermath of the election. Both were against the plan conceived by conservative lawyer John Eastman, working on then President Trump's behalf, for Mr. Pence to reject the electoral count on January 6th, a plan that was embraced by Mr. Trump himself in the lead-up to the Capitol riot. The hearing was direct from the start.
What the president wanted the vice president to do was not just wrong. It was illegal and unconstitutional. We will hear many details in today's hearing, but please consider these 2 points. First, President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis.
Our review of text, history, and frankly just common sense all confirmed the vice president's first instinct on that point. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the vice president has that kind of authority.
And Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett joins us now. Hey, Major. So some really striking testimony from some very conservative lawyers. What was interesting was the lawyer for former Vice President Mike Pence said that when Pence heard about the scheme to overturn the election, he rejected it. Here's attorney Greg Jacobs.
The vice president's first instinct when he heard this theory was that there was no way that our framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome, because they were on the ticket for the election in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome of the election.
So you have Vice President Mike Pence rejecting that proposal, but what else did we learn about John Eastman's roadmap to try to keep President Trump in office?
Well, first of all, that it was a roadmap of an invention. It's not part of any scholarship associated with what the Constitution says, what the 12th Amendment says, what the Electoral Count Act said. It essentially is made up out of whole cloth. That's the most important thing that emerged from today's testimony and other reporting leading up to today. This is not a theory that has any traction, Caitlin, anywhere, but it had traction in the Trump White House in the waning days of the Trump administration for one reason and one reason only. Former President Trump wanted to believe it and see if he could put it in motion. And the central roadblock to putting this cockamamie constitutional theory, and I'm being generous with those words, was the Vice President, Mike Pence. And privately and publicly, the former president tried to use his Twitter account and rhetoric and face-to-face meetings, not just with the former vice president, but with his staff, to pressure them to do something they knew was illegal, unconstitutional, and utterly without precedent in the history of our country. And all of those things emerged very clearly today. And the voices, Caitlin, that articulated those central facts were not constitutional alarmists, people who use florid rhetoric to talk about dangers to our constitutional republic and the democracy that supports it. These are people who are very constrained in their rhetoric and language, Greg Jacob and Michael Ludig. But they both used rhetoric that was basically saying this presidency, in its waning days, was trying to set fire to the Constitution, overturn a valid and confirmed presidential election, and topple everything that this country had previously understood about the rule of law. That's pretty striking.
Absolutely, and that's a really important point to underscore, that these are conservative attorneys. And hearing from Ludig in particular, you could just hear and kind of feel the weight of this moment. I mean, he really took his time with his words, made his argument very clearly, and you could tell that he was doing this out of a sense of duty, really, to the Constitution and to the country. What's also interesting, and Major, I know you have reported extensively on Trump and Pence throughout the campaign, throughout the presidency, and what was striking here, too, is that we saw kind of the fraying of the relationship between Pence and Trump. Pete Aguilar, one of the congressmen on the committee, brought up our own Robert Costa's reporting from his book, which kind of described this rift between Mike Pence and Trump leading up to January 6th. I think we have some of that.
In the book Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, "If these people say you have the power, wouldn't you want to?" The vice president says, quote, "I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority." The president responds, "But wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power?" The vice president is reported to have said, "No, look, I've read this, and I don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible."
So what do we know about how frayed that relationship was?
It became very frayed in that moment. And I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things that we heard from that excellent reporting of Bob Woodward and our colleague Bob Costa. The vice president didn't say to former President Trump, "Look, you're wrong from the outset. I'm not even going to look into this." He could have said that and been on completely firm legal, constitutional, and historical ground, but he didn't. He said, "I've looked into this, and then some." Caitlin, this was true of so many people who worked in the Trump White House. It wasn't that they told the president, "I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to disregard your theories about the election. I'm going to look into them." And once they did and looked into all various corridors of it, whether the election was stolen, whether there were irregularities, whether there were votes that were switched, all these various theories, they looked into all of them, found no justifiable basis for any of them. And then the vice president looked into this particular very unusual, and again, I'm being kind, constitutional theory, and said, "It's not there, Mr. President." So they were trying to be loyal to their jobs, to the person who employed them, the President of the United States, but more importantly, the institution and the Constitution they swore an oath to. And ultimately, it was that loyalty that, if you'll allow me, I rarely do this, trumped the request of the president.
Yeah, it's a fair assessment to use there, and a good reminder, too, that Pence was the most loyal in the Trump administration and his ally. And another really striking moment came, in my view, from White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. He was discussing Eastman's plan to reject the electoral votes. Listen to this.
He described for me what he thought the ambiguity was in the statute, and he was walking through it at that time. And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. And I said, are you out of your effing mind?
So we heard from others today, too, that Eastman himself admitted that this plan wouldn't even hold up scrutiny in the Supreme Court. Jacob said as much, that it would likely not stand, the Supreme Court wouldn't stand for it. So what does the committee seem to be getting at by pointing all of this out here?
That John Eastman knew that this was a theory that had no constitutional or legal foundation beneath it, and that he was selling it to former President Trump in order to curry favor for unknown reasons. And in so doing, he was part of an effort to subvert the will of the people, to interfere with a congressional process to certify a presidential election. And that is why the committee disclosed today he took the Fifth Amendment 100 times during his appearance before the committee, and, as the committee disclosed today, asked to be put on the pardon list. So, the audience, I invite you to consider, why does someone take the Fifth Amendment? It is that person's constitutional right, of course, 100 times, and then try to get on the pardon list if they believe this theory is valid, legal, and consistent with the Constitution.
Also, as today's hearings were getting going, we learned that the Select Committee wants to and will ask Ginny Thomas, who of course is the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, to come in for an interview. Can you kind of remind us about why they are interested in her and kind of the conversation she was apparently having with the president's chief of staff?
Right. So Bob Costa, our colleague, has reported, along with Bob Woodward, that there were text messages between Ginny Thomas and Mark Meadows, urging him to stand tall and do everything he can to stop the certification of the Biden election and to retain former President Trump in power while he was still in power. Then we've also learned there were some kind of email conversations between Ginny Thomas and John Eastman. And one of the things we learned today in the testimony from Greg Jacob was, one theory that John Eastman had is if this was ever challenged in court and brought before the Supreme Court might not want to wade into this because it's a political controversy that the Supreme Court might decide was out of its realm. Now, you have to go back to Bush v. Gore and remind yourself the Supreme Court has waded into political controversies before, so it's not really logical that it wouldn't have this time. But anyway, that was John Eastman's theory. Was that in any way informed by conversations with Ginny Thomas, the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice? The committee wants to find out about that, and just how much Ginny Thomas's advocacy on this front, again, to keep President Trump in power and to deny the valid and verified election results of 2020, how much of that bled over to any of her conversations or likely outcomes that would have been brought to bear by a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas.
Very interesting questions and some consequential action that could come from the revelation of those text messages. Major Garrett, as we are every day, but especially on days like today, we are grateful for your insight and reporting. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and dive into the White House and the economy, other big headlines today. So for that, let's bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Hey there, Ed. Good to be with you. Thanks for being here. So we understand that the president just gave an interview to the Associated Press that came out this afternoon. What did we learn about this? I mean, I assume that talk number one was really the economy.
Yep, it was. And Caitlin, it's rare for the president to give a sit-down interview to a news wire or a newspaper. what we would traditionally call a newspaper. Rare that he give an interview to any news organization these days, but he did it this afternoon with the Associated Press, the world's largest news wire. It was primarily about the economy. And he says in part that the American people are, quote, really, really down, unquote, after a tumultuous 2 years with the pandemic, the volatile economy, and now surging gas prices. He was pressed on whether he thinks a recession is inevitable, and he dismissed that, saying absolutely not. But he's also doing something now that I think we're going to hear the White House do a lot more, and say, yes, we're dealing with inflation, but it's, quote, global inflation. This is a worldwide phenomena, and that it's far worse in other parts of the world, Canada, Asia, Europe, not in the United States, where, in the view of the president and the Federal Reserve, the underlying economy is in good shape. There's still growth. There's still low unemployment. There are jobs out there if people need them. He's arguing we're dealing with inflation, or the central bank is certainly pushing us in the direction to help end it, but it's a lot worse if you live somewhere else. That is something we've seen sort of creep into the language of aides, and now we're seeing it in a conversation the president had with the AP.
And Ed, we were talking about this earlier this week because there is, little that the president can actually do when it comes to some of these issues. But yet they, have to, of course, demonstrate that they're working on it. We do know that he met, however, with Speaker Pelosi and Senate Majority Chuck Schumer last night. Do we know about what happened at that meeting, and if there's anything that they can, point to say that they're working on this?
As someone reminded me, look, these are the three people who run this town. So it's perfectly normal and acceptable and expected that they would get together every so often to talk about the agenda, given that for now, at least, the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they've got to worry about issue number one, the economy. So yes, there were some conversations broadly about what other economic legislation or budgetary legislation may be out there to deal with inflation, with sustaining the economic growth, and dealing with some other dollars and cents issues like healthcare affordability and whatnot. One of the big issues that they're trying to sort out is there still an opportunity to use what we talked about on this show plenty, that expression reconciliation, not the Catholic sacrament, but the budget authority that a majority party has, especially in the Senate, to move a piece of spending legislation with a simple majority vote and try to get some partisan priorities achieved. There are ongoing conversations among Democrats about how to do that, what to do exactly, and how to deliver something before the August recess or the fall when people start voting that demonstrates Democrats are doing something to deal with inflation and economic growth overall.
And on that note, I think you could argue that another person that runs this town is Joe Manchin. He seems to be poised once again to be the linchpin to anything Democrats want to do. You talk about reconciliation. How is leadership kind of trying to bring him on board for some of this?
By not talking much about it in public, but we do know that they are continuing to try to come up with something that not only would be acceptable to Joe Manchin, but to other moderate Democrats who, of course, were involved in the negotiations we spent so much time covering in the past year or so. Kirsten Sinema, a handful of moderates that are on the ballot in Senate races this fall, like Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, or Mark Kelly in Arizona, or Catherine Cortez Masto and Raphael Warnock in Nevada and Georgia. Finding something that speaks to the election year concerns, that achieves some partisan priorities in terms of climate change, in terms of other domestic spending programs, and then potentially also health care and some concerns there about premium costs and prescription drugs and other issues that they've been trying to sort out. We should point out that absent the economic work, there have been some modest successes in recent days in terms of getting legislation passed that speaks to the moment. There's a burn pits legislation bill that's on its way to the White House eventually once the House passes it. There's going to be, there was a legislation regarding Supreme Court security ahead of the abortion fight. There are other pieces of bipartisan legislation working their way through. They're struggling, of course, on the issue of guns. There were some breakup on that today. But underlying all of that, or in the midst of all that, Democrats still trying to find a way to negotiate over some dollars and cents legislation and see if they can get something done before November.
And something to bring back to their constituents as they ask for their vote, indeed.
Exactly.
Ed O'Keefe from the White House, thank you so much.
Take care.
And the first bipartisan agreement on gun legislation is starting to hit some bumps in the road. Congresswoman Dina Titus joins us on the big sticking points and where both sides may have to give to get something passed. You're streaming Red and Blue.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy.
Why would they pay for that? Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like,
wow. Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there are hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes,
that's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
you know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more. Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yes. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed true to his oath to protect and defend the Constitution.
As we've been reporting, the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack held its third public hearing today. The panel focused on the pressure former Vice President Mike Pence faced to reject electoral votes. Here's Scott McFarland with more.
Caitlin, the committee was really emphasizing the danger Mike Pence was in at the Capitol January 6th from a mob, some of whom were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," near where a gallows and noose were erected. But it's all about proximity, how close this crowd came. Let me open up the Capitol, take you to the first floor. The tip of the spear here. One branch of this mob was smashing open a window, in this case with a stolen police riot shield. This is an accused Proud Boy, and in their court filings last year, the Justice Department said they have a witness who says the Proud Boys would have murdered Mike Pence if they'd gotten to him that day. And this group, this mob, got very close to Mike Pence. The second floor of the Capitol will show you how close. Shortly after he was evacuated from the Senate chamber, here comes some of the crowd inside, some carrying flags and signs and bullhorns, some, including this defendant, Jacob Chansley, who's already in prison serving his term, at Mike Pence's desk, leaving a note that says, "A matter of time, justice is coming." Others in this mob were carrying things beyond flags and signs. Zip ties, tactical gear, scaling the walls. It was moments earlier, at about 2:25 p.m., when Mike Pence was evacuated from the Senate chamber. He'd go underground, as we heard today, and remain in an underground bunker. But it was just 35 minutes later when a different branch of the crowd came running up that same staircase, banging on doors, carrying tactical gear and breathing apparatus. What the committee was trying to show today is Mike Pence was in grave danger, and a riotous mob got very close. Caitlin?
All right, Scott McFarland, thank you. Negotiators are hoping to get gun reform legislation through the Senate before lawmakers go on a July 4th recess. But some key Republican senators have some reservations about the aspect of the framework. The lead Republican negotiator is Senator John Cornyn, and he says that some of the provisions could be dropped if lawmakers remain at a standstill. He said details on red flag laws and the so-called boyfriend loophole are raising problems. Senator Cornyn left talks early on Thursday saying, quote, "I don't know what they have in mind, but I'm through talking." So let's bring in Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus, who represents Nevada's 1st District. Congresswoman, good to see you. Thank you for being here. So some sticking points on the Senate side. Remains to be seen whether they can actually get a deal done. But the House did pass legislation. What's different between the House and Senate versions, and what's the same?
Well, the House version was a lot stronger than the Senate version. It was already watered down considerably. For example, my provision to outlaw bump stocks was not in the Senate version. And also, the age requirement for buying an automatic weapon was not in the Senate version. That's very disappointing. You know, I represent the district where the shooting took place at Mandalay Bay concert, where a person used bump stocks. I thought it was a miracle if the Senate would do anything. So even though the bill was weaker, at least it was a step forward. But there are so many arcane rules in the Senate, and people can hold up things, even one senator sometimes. Plus, they have to write the bill. The devil's in the details. And now you can already see spinning off the back, the boyfriend loophole. House passed that twice in the Violence Against Women Act, taken out by the Senate, and now they're taking that off the table for the negotiations. If they pass anything, I'll be surprised, and if they do, it'll probably be so watered down it'll be little more than funding for mental health.
And even if it is a watered down version, whatever they get to, would you commit to supporting it once it gets to the House?
Well, when it comes back to the House, there will be those in the progressive movement who say it's not enough. And I certainly agree with that. But you got to start somewhere. This is all we can get. If it's just a baby step, well, that's better than nothing. The public, though, wants more done. Look at public opinion. They are not satisfied with just the little amount the Senate's talking about.
Another piece of legislation that you're a co-sponsor of on the House side is this excise tax on assault weapons. Can you kind of explain how exactly that would work, and do you think that stands any chance of passage?
It may pass out of the House, won't pass out of the Senate, but it sends a good message. You know, it used to be illegal to buy a machine gun, an assault weapon. That ended some 10 or so years ago. You can't seem to get that passed, even though we will probably vote on a version of that as a standalone bill in the House. But if you can't get an outlaw passed, then maybe you can just price those guns out of existence. The bill, introduced also by Don Beyer of Virginia, says there will be a $1,000 excise tax. If you buy a gun for $100, then 1,000% of an excise tax would be put on top of that. So if you can't outlaw the guns, at least you can make them hard to buy or hard to sell.
And Congressman, you've been working on this issue for a while. You mentioned you represent the district where we saw that mass shooting in Las Vegas. Do you feel, talking to your Republican colleagues, that there has been any sort of shift in feeling towards gun legislation?
Well, we got a few votes on the House side, 5 members. Most of those weren't running for re-election. I believe it was about 13 or so voted on the provision concerning bump stocks, and it got more Republican votes than any other provision. Now, usually, though, all we do is thoughts and prayers. We have a moment of silence, and then the issue goes away. People forget about it until the next shooting occurs. But we've had so many shootings recently that it's hard to ignore, whether it's a grocery store or a church or a concert. They come almost on a daily basis. So the public is beginning to be more demanding, and maybe they in turn can put pressure on the Republicans. But so far, those in the House have been pretty strong about opposing anything that goes against what the NRA wants.
And I want to switch gears a little bit just because we have been covering this January 6th Select Committee, these hearings, and we heard today from those close to Mike Pence and also from a very conservative constitutional lawyer. I'm curious about, have you been watching these hearings and what are your thoughts watching your colleagues on that committee?
Well, I'm most impressed by it, and I supported having that bipartisan committee like we did after 9/11. Anytime you can get members of the House to act in a nonpartisan, non-emotional way and be very disciplined about the questions they ask, it's amazing. And that's exactly what they've done. They have gradually built the case against Donald Trump. And today they used the vice president and the danger he was put in to help make the case that the president knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was unconstitutional. He knew it was illegal. And yet he went ahead and did it against the advice of most of his own folks.
And certainly more hearings to come and more information to come. Representative Dina Titus, thank you so much for your time and for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
With gas prices at record highs, the White House is scrambling to do whatever it can to bring them down. But his past comments about fossil fuels, which still provide the bulk of energy in America, may have complicated things for him. We'll ask a top oil executive why prices are so high and what it may take to bring them back down. Plus, arrests at the southern border are reaching alarming levels. More on the numbers behind an immigration problem that keeps simmering as a political issue. You're streaming Red and Blue.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's going to bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes,
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
you know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth
Right now.
We got something crazy.
and reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Here's a look at some of our top stories. President Biden says a recession is not inevitable following the Federal Reserve's increase of the nation's interest rate by 0.75 points. In a statement Thursday, the president says he's confident the country can overcome rising inflation despite low morale among consumers and investors. Plus, Senate negotiations on gun reform are stalled as the group of bipartisan negotiators disagree on so-called red flag laws and the boyfriend loophole. Chief Republican negotiator John Cornyn says the legislation is expected to move forward once the two issues are resolved. And the House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack held its third public hearing Thursday. Lawmakers focused on former President Trump's efforts to pressure Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the 2020 presidential election results. Skylar Henry has more from Capitol Hill.
The House January 6th committee presented more dramatic video as they detailed former President Trump's efforts to pressure his vice president, Mike Pence, into blocking congressional certification of the election.
He knew it was illegal. He knew it was wrong. We're fortunate for Mr. Pence's courage.
As these disagreements became more public, that the president would lash out in some way.
Taped testimony from top Pence advisors showed they and several top Trump White House officials disagreed with the former president's lawyer, John Eastman's theory that the vice president could block electoral votes.
I said, are you out of your effing mind? I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets.
In-person witnesses included former Pence advisors Greg Jacob and retired federal judge J. Michael Loudermilk.
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew and had studied about our Constitution that one person would have that kind of authority.
There was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all.
Thursday, committee chairman Benny Thompson told reporters that it may be time to invite conservative activist Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, to speak to the committee. CBS News has confirmed the Washington Post reporting that Eastman emailed with Ms. Thomas. Mrs. Thomas also exchanged multiple text messages with Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows about overturning the election results. The Daily Caller says Mrs. Thomas has signaled she may be willing to talk, telling them she, quote, can't wait to clear up misconceptions. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
The Biden administration is trying to show that it's on top of skyrocketing gas prices. In a letter to 7 oil companies yesterday, Mr. Biden said, quote, your companies need to work with my administration to bring forward concrete near-term solutions. The letter comes as gas prices are around $2 higher today than they were a year ago. That's according to the AAA. SVP of Policy, Economics, and Regulatory Affairs at the American Petroleum Institute, Frank Macchiarola, joins us now. Hi, Frank. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it. So in a statement...
Thanks for having me on.
Sure. In a statement responding to the president, the American Petroleum Institute president, Mike Summers, called Mr. Biden's approach, quote, misguided. So what do you think the administration has gotten wrong on their approach to this issue?
Sure. First off, inflation's at a 40-year high. Gas prices at the national average have reached over $5. A lot of that has to do with supply and demand dynamics and the pandemic and the imbalance between supply and demand. But some of that has to do with policy. From their first day in office, the Biden administration has shut down access to oil and gas production on federal lands. They've canceled pipeline projects. They've increased taxes on domestic producers that are competing globally. And so some of this lays at the doorstep of this administration.
On that note, however, the president has taken some heat from domestic oil producers who are saying basically, why are you talking to Venezuela and Saudi Arabia? He's obviously going there for a trip this summer and not increasing oil production domestically, as you say. But what would that actually take to increase domestically oil production here? That seems like a further off goal that wouldn't really alleviate prices right now.
Well, the first thing that it takes is the administration promoting and advancing oil and natural gas production right here in the United States. So scrap those policies that I mentioned earlier and incentivize a more American production. Instead of going to visit Riyadh, visit the oil and gas producers in the Permian Basin in Texas or in the Bakken in North Dakota. Visit the refineries in Louisiana. Stand with the men and women in the American oil and gas industry who are producing energy that's affordable, reliable, and abundant for the American people. It's critical for our energy security. Canceling pipeline projects, that harms the America's energy security. That causes these high prices that we've seen. And so they really need a policy shift out of this administration.
And how responsible are oil companies for some of this as well? I mean, the administration, Democrats on Capitol Hill have been saying that, there's price gouging going on, that they could help bring down some of these prices. What do you say to that argument?
Well, the Federal Trade Commission has looked into this allegation of price gouging several times over several years. They've never found it to be true. What they found is that the primary source of price of gasoline is the price of crude oil, which is traded on a global basis. And that's basically driven by fundamentals of supply and demand. As I noted, we had a strong demand surge coming out of the pandemic. Supplies have not kept pace. Policies, talking about investment in other sources of energy, moving away from oil and gas, all these factors have had an impact. But what we need out of the administration is support for a long-term policy that promotes energy production here in the United States, that promotes the development of energy infrastructure to get energy from where it's produced to where it's needed. We need an administration that promotes and advances American energy. Look, we had a shale revolution here in the United States over 10 years that made America energy secure. It doubled our production in oil and natural gas here in the United States. It made us independent from foreign sources that we've been relying on for so many years. The administration needs to return to that type of policy that strengthens U.S. energy security.
As we've been talking, we've been showing photos of the price of gas, $6, $7 a gallon in some places. So I think Americans want to know, besides all the politics, besides the policy, when can we actually expect prices to come back down? When can we expect that?
Well, look, we can't estimate prices, but what we can say is that when the fundamentals return, when supply and demand are rebalanced, we'll see some relief at the pump. And, we're starting to see production come back here in the United States. And that's an important point. For the first time in June, for the first time since April of 2020, we're producing more than 12 million barrels per day in the United States. The Permian Basin, our largest source of oil, is at near record level of production. We've increased rig count by more than 200 oil rigs year over year during this year. And so you are starting to see supplies come back. But again, we've had surging demand coming out of COVID, and it will take some time for those things to balance.
Surging demand, especially ahead of summer vacation time. Frank Macchiarola, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Arrests at the U.S. southern border reached an all-time high in May. According to the Department of Homeland Security, Border Patrol agents processed more than 239,000 migrants last month. 69% of the people apprehended were adults traveling alone. 25% of the encounters involved migrants who were previously apprehended by Border Patrol in the past year. Officials say 42% of the people processed in May were expelled from the country under the pandemic-era policy Title 42. Former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin has advanced in the primary election for Alaska's only House seat. Palin was among the field of 48 candidates vying to replace late Republican Representative Don Young. The former Alaska governor was endorsed by former President Trump in April. She led this week's primary race with 28% of the vote. Republican Nick Begich and independent Al Gross also advanced to the August 16th special election. The winner of that race will will serve the remainder of Young's term, which ends in January. Perceived voting machine issues continue to plague elections, this time in New Mexico. Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse-Oliver asked the state Supreme Court to step in and order Otero County to certify votes in its June 7th primary. The High Court did so on Wednesday. The governing commission in the county had previously refused to certify the election results of that primary because of Dominion voting machines. The commissioners in the conservative pro-Trump county, however, could point to no actual problems with the equipment. President Biden is set to visit Saudi Arabia next month, reversing a campaign pledge to punish the kingdom for killing an American-based journalist. We'll get into the historic importance of this relationship and how it's evolved in recent years. You're streaming Red and Blue.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like. Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
President Biden is set to visit Saudi Arabia next month, despite repeatedly taking a hard stance against the country, even calling the Saudi regime a pariah after journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. A U.S. intelligence report concluded Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman directly ordered the killing. Mr. Biden's upcoming trip has drawn criticism from human rights groups and several members of his own party. So for more, I want to bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. Christina, good to see you. So I remember on the campaign trail, President Biden, then candidate Biden, calling Saudi Arabia a pariah and said that they would be held accountable for the things that its leaders have done, including the killing of an American journalist. How does this trip do that?
Well, that's the question now, isn't it? I mean, you have President Biden way out there saying, look, this Jamal Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul, right? Somebody has to be held accountable for that. So when the administration came in, they sanctioned some lower level officials. They did this thing called the Khashoggi ban, where they can take action against people who do these kinds of things, against journalists, against human rights advocates. And they took this big stance. When Secretary Blinken came to office, he gave this impassioned speech about human rights and how that needs to play a role in our diplomacy and our international policy. But what always happens is the best intentions of some of these administrations get shouted down by the reality. And the reality is this administration's biggest threat at the moment to re-election is going to be this gas crisis. So they are now going to Saudi Arabia. The president had also said he wasn't going to deal with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince, who essentially runs the country and who that intelligence report said had to have ordered that killing. There was no one else who could have done it. President Biden initially said he was only going to meet with the king. Now he is also meeting with the crown prince. So it's a rubber meets the road, realpolitik kind of slap in the face to what this administration wanted to do, because they also need to show their domestic audience they are out there, they are talking to one of the biggest oil producers in the world and doing everything they can to bring down gas prices for the American consumer, which is really what's going to hit them, not just in the midterms, but 3 years from now when we do this all over again, 4 years from now. I've lost track of what day it is, what time it is, but you know what I mean.
Soon enough. I mean, I do want to ask you a little bit more about those kind of competing dynamics and kind of how the State Department is handling all of this, because when President Biden took office, you had Secretary Blinken, as you say, kind of making a big deal about saying that this administration would be prioritizing human rights. I mean, that made some big headlines. So how exactly has that philosophy translated into actual policy?
This is something that diplomats really struggle with, and this is something that successive administrations have also struggled with. And it's not just when it comes to human rights. You know, if you remember, this administration also came into office saying they were going to pivot to China. They were really going to focus their efforts on the Pacific Asia realm. They wanted to build up alliances there. Then Afghanistan happened. Now Ukraine happened. We saw something similar with the Trump administration. They were going to pivot to China. They also got bogged down in the Middle East. President Obama said the same thing. You know, when they announced their pivot to China, I literally said to them, I've heard this before, and they laughed at me. But you know, it always happens, and it's you know, you can have all the aspirations you want, but this is why people get so frustrated when they get into office, and why people tend to be more popular out of office than they are when they're in office, because you have to make these hard decisions, and sometimes there are no good decisions. But this trip is being highly criticized by some Democrats, and especially, you know, Jamal Khashoggi's fiance has also criticized the trip and said, you know, she doesn't think that that the president should be meeting with MBS because it's essentially a forgiveness card. It looks like a forgiveness. It signals that the U.S. is ready to make this rapprochement, and everything, all this harsh language they said about holding them accountable, it's hard to tell where that's really happening.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about kind of the influence that our elections ends up having on foreign policy, because the pendulum swings back and forth so quickly. As you mentioned, you know, every 4 years, of course, we have a changing in party. I mean, we saw the Trump administration have a very close relationship with Saudi leadership, defying
there's that amazing photo of them all standing around that orb, right?
Exactly.
Holding the magical glowing globe. Yeah.
Exactly. Kind of the iconic picture of that visit. And then you had the Obama administration, which was not so much. Can you kind of give us a bigger picture here about how the U.S.-Saudi relationship has, you know, evolved in recent years?
Well, it's a strategic ally whether we want them to be or not. And the fact of the matter is the Saudis do have some things the U.S. need, especially in that region. The Biden administration itself has said this is not just about oil. It's not just about petroleum. It's a strategic ally. Look, the Saudis have a lot of intelligence gathering capacity. The U.S. doesn't. They also have, you know, resources. They have military bases. They have military assets. These are all things that the U.S. has relied on and will need to rely on again. So even though the aspirations may be to only deal with nice people, when it comes to the reality of the world, sometimes you need to make deals with less nice people to, you know, obtain other objectives. And that seems to be the calculation the Biden administration, like administrations before it, are making here.
Yeah, and a good reminder that campaigning is very different than governing. And then, you know, you mentioned that this trip is really all about gas prices and the pinch that people are feeling here at home, and the administration feeling like they have to do something. But has Saudi Arabia reacted at all to requests to release additional oil to help alleviate that? I mean, if this trip is all about gas prices, essentially, what are they signaling that they might be able to do to help bring those costs down?
Well, the Biden administration says this trip is not all about gas prices. They said it's also about strategic relationship. It's about security issues that it shares with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have said they're willing to have this discussion, but oil production is not quite the biggest issue. A lot of oil refineries, especially in the U.S., are at max capacity. So there's not much more. Even if they pump out more crude, there's not the refining capacity to get to the pump. And that's one thing the Biden administration has tried to go after this week. They've said, look, there are record high profits, and there's no reason for that. They're, you know, kind of imploring and chastising the oil companies to bring the price down, because there's a bit of a gap between the supply and demand, and it seems like there's some price gouging going on. Now, it's unclear how much influence Saudi or OPEC could have, even if the Biden administration were able to negotiate something. But the point is, like we mentioned earlier, they need to be able to show they're trying. They need to be able to show that they're doing everything they can to mitigate this pressure on the American consumer, on the average everyday American who is feeling this, you know, more than anyone. And that's who's going to vote when it comes to November.
And people who will be watching that foreign trip, the brilliant as ever, Christina Ruffini, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
We're going to take a quick break, which means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you're at it, check out Paramount Plus. We've got a mountain of content for you to stream there as well, including your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like. Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
The Senate has passed a bill aimed at helping veterans who were exposed to toxic burn pits overseas. The legislation would establish a connection between the pits and certain illnesses, making it easier for those impacted to obtain health care benefits. Natalie Brand has more from Washington.
On this vote, the yeas are 84, the nays are 14.
The U.S. Senate cast an overwhelming bipartisan vote and took a step forward in the fight to help veterans exposed to burn pits and other toxic hazards while stationed overseas.
This is the greatest advance in veterans' health care in decades.
This bill is about righting a wrong that has been ignored for just way too damn long.
It's a moment advocates spent years pushing for amid rising numbers of respiratory illnesses and cancers among veterans of the armed forces. The Senate bill is named for Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson.
He fought valiantly for 3 years to survive as long as he could for his daughter.
The new legislation will make it easier for veterans to claim benefits and treatment for 23 diseases and rare cancers related to toxic exposure. CBS News has reported on veterans who spent years fighting to get their claims approved, with most denied in recent years. It's an issue that caught the attention and focus of comedian Jon Stewart.
This doesn't solve anybody's problem. This just removes the burden from their fight that never should have been there in the first place.
President Biden has talked about this issue and about his own son's lost battle with brain cancer after serving in Iraq near burn pits. He's expected to sign the bill as quickly as it reaches his desk.
First, it must head back to the House, where the Speaker has promised to move swiftly to take it up. It's estimated the legislation could help around 3.5 million veterans exposed to toxic fumes. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Washington.
Vice President Harris is launching a new task force aimed at combating online harassment and abuse. The group met for the first time Thursday. It will be co-chaired by the Gender Policy Council and the National Security Council. The task force will particularly focus on illegal online activities such as cyberstalking and the distribution of sexual images without consent. Officials involved are expected to provide specific recommendations to the federal government and the private sector within 180 days. That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.